Karen's face twisted in rage as she slammed her fists on the hood of my car, her shrill screams piercing the otherwise peaceful suburban afternoon. Little did she know the shocking twist that was about to unfold. I had just pulled into my driveway after a long day at the office, exhausted and ready to unwind. As I reached to open the car door, movement in my peripheral vision caused me to freeze. Suddenly, Karen, my neighbor from 2 doors down, came barreling across the lawn, her eyes wild and her expression contorted with fury. "You inconsiderate jerk," she screeched, pounding on the glossy paint of my brand-new sit-in. "How dare you park in front of my house again?" I stared at her in stunned silence, unsure of how to respond. Karen and I had been at odds for months over the most trivial of neighborhood disputes. Everything from the height of my hedges to the location of my trash cans seemed to set her off. "Karen, calm down," I said, raising my hands in a placating gesture. "I'm just pulling into my own driveway. There's no need to make a scene." "No need?" She spat, her face turning an alarming shade of red. "You're ruining the aesthetic of the entire street, you selfish." Suddenly, the passenger side door of my car swung open, and a stern-faced man in a black robe stepped out, his gavel clutched firmly in one hand. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" he demanded, his booming voice cutting through Karen's tirade. Karen froze, her mouth hanging open in stunned silence as she stared at the imposing figure before her. I felt a surge of vindication wash over me. Clearly, she hadn't expected her theatrics to be witnessed by someone of such authority. I, Karen stammered, the color draining from her face. "I am Judge Hendricks, and I will not tolerate this kind of disruptive behavior in my neighborhood," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "Now, I suggest you return to your own home and reflect on your actions." Karen's shoulders slumped, and she cast a resentful glance in my direction before shuffling back across the lawn, her head hung low. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction at the turn of events, but as I watched her retreat, a small pang of guilt tugged at my conscience. Perhaps there was more to this feud than met the eye. As Karen sulked back to her house, Judge Hendricks turned to me, his expression shifting from stern to one of slight amusement. "Well, young man, it seems you've managed to ruffle your neighbor's feathers quite thoroughly," he said, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. I felt a surge of embarrassment, realizing that a respected member of the community had witnessed my petty neighborhood squabble. "I'm very sorry you had to see that, sir," I said, my voice tinged with chagrin. "Karen and I have been at odds for a while, but I never intended for it to escalate to this." The judge waved a hand dismissively. "No need to apologize. I've seen my fair share of neighborhood disputes over the years." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "Though I must say, your neighbor's behavior was rather excessive." I nodded, releasing a heavy sigh. "You got that right. Karen has a tendency to overreact to the slightest provocation. I swear she's like a ticking time bomb, just waiting to explode." Judge Hendricks chuckled. "Indeed. Though I must say, her little outburst did provide me with a rather entertaining start to my day." I couldn't help but smile at that. "Well, I'm glad my misfortune could at least bring you a bit of amusement, sir." The judge's expression suddenly turned serious. "Speaking of which, I don't suppose you'd be willing to share the details of your ongoing feud with your neighbor? As a member of the community, I feel it's my duty to try and mediate these sorts of disputes whenever possible." I hesitated, unsure of whether I should divulge the personal details of my conflict with Karen. But there was something about the judge's genuine concern that made me want to open up. "Well, it all started a few months ago when I began, launching into the story of how our neighborly dispute had spiraled out of control. As I spoke, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief at finally having someone impartial to confide in. Perhaps this chance encounter with the judge could be the key to finally resolving the tension between Karen and me. As I recounted the sordid history of my feud with Karen, Judge Hendricks listened intently, his brow furrowing with each new detail. When I had finally finished, He let out a long, contemplative sigh. I see, he said, stroking his chin thoughtfully. It's clear that this conflict has been brewing for some time. And from what you've told me, it seems that both you and your neighbor have played a role in escalating the situation. I nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt. You're right, sir. I'll admit that I may have reacted to some of Karen's complaints in a less than ideal way. But her constant harassment and passive-aggressive behavior has really worn me down over time. The judge hummed in understanding. I can certainly empathize with the frustration of dealing with a difficult neighbor. However, responding to her provocations with further antagonism is unlikely to resolve the issue in a constructive manner. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the weight of his words. I know, you're absolutely right. But it's just so hard to remain calm and level-headed when she's constantly pushing my buttons. That may be true, Judge Hendricks conceded, but as a member of this community, you have an obligation to set a better example. He paused, fixing me with a stern gaze. And as a judge, I can assure you that resorting to physical confrontation or property damage will only land you in even deeper trouble. I swallowed hard, the gravity of his words sinking in. I understand, sir. I'll do my best to handle this situation more responsibly going forward. The judge nodded, the severity of his expression softening slightly. Good. Now, I believe the first step in resolving this conflict is to extend an olive branch to your neighbor. An olive branch. I echoed, my brow furrowing in skepticism. After everything she's put me through. I know it may not be easy, Judge Hendricks acknowledged, but taking the high road is often the best path forward. Reaching out to Karen in a spirit of goodwill and openness to dialogue could be the key to diffusing the tension between you two. I mulled over his words, seeing the logic in his suggestion, even if it went against my natural instinct to retaliate. All right, I'll give it a try, but I can't make any promises about how she'll respond. The judge chuckled dryly. That's fair enough. Just remember, the true test of character is how one handles adversity. He paused, his expression turning contemplative once more. And who knows, this may be an opportunity for both of you to find a productive way to coexist in this community. With that, Judge Hendricks nodded firmly and turned to re-enter my car, leaving me to ponder his advice. As I watched him drive away, I couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of determination. Perhaps this unexpected encounter was the catalyst I needed to finally put an end to my ongoing feud with Karen. Over the next few days, I found myself carefully contemplating Judge Hendricks' advice. As much as I wanted to simply ignore Karen and her constant harassment, I knew deep down that the time had come to take a different approach. Steeling my nerves, I marched across the street to Karen's front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath and raised my hand to knock, pausing for a moment to gather my thoughts. When the door swung open, I was met with a scowl that could have curdled milk. "What do you want?" Karen snapped, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Hi, Karen," I began, forcing a conciliatory smile. "I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes. I think it's time we try to resolve this neighborhood dispute between us." Karen's expression shifted from one of hostility to pure bewilderment. "Resolve?" she echoed, her brow furrowing. "What on earth are you talking about?" I took another deep breath, silently reminding myself to stay calm and composed. "Look, I know things have been tense between us for a while now, and I think it's time we tried to find a way to coexist peacefully." Karen's eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt cross her features. She stammered, "I don't know what you mean." "Come on, Karen," I pressed gently. "We both know this feud has been going on for far too long. And frankly, I'm tired of it. Aren't you?" She opened her mouth to respond, then quickly snapped it shut again, her gaze shifting nervously. I suppose so," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," I said, nodding with cautious optimism. Then why don't we start over? No more passive-aggressive jabs or petty disputes. Just two neighbors trying to find a way to get along. Karen studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to my surprise, the corners of her mouth turned upward in a tentative smile. All right, she conceded, her tone softening. I think I'd like that. Relief washed over me, and I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to dissipate. Wonderful, I said, offering her a genuine smile in return. How about we grab a cup of coffee sometime this week? My treat. Karen hesitated for a moment, then nodded. That sounds nice. As I turned to head back to my own house, I couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, this unexpected encounter with Judge Hendricks had been the push I needed to finally break the cycle of conflict with my difficult neighbor. True to my word, I invited Karen over for coffee the following weekend. As she stepped across the threshold into my home, I couldn't help but feel a palpable sense of tension in the air. The memory of her wild-eyed outburst on my car hood still lingered, and I couldn't help but wonder if this attempt at reconciliation was doomed to fail. However, to my surprise, Karen seemed almost uncharacteristically subdued. Gone was the fiery temper I had grown accustomed to. In its place was a palpable air of apprehension. "Thank you for having me," she murmured, her gaze shifting awkwardly around the room. "Of course," I replied, gesturing toward the plush armchair in my living room. "Please, make yourself comfortable." As we settled in with our steaming mugs of coffee, an uncomfortable silence settled between us. I cleared my throat, determined to be the one to break the ice. "So, Karen," I began, "I wanted to apologize for the way things have been between us. I know we've had our fair share of disagreements over the years, and I think it's high time we try to put all that behind us." Karen blinked, her brow furrowing in what appeared to be genuine surprise. "You're apologizing?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. I nodded, offering her a conciliatory smile. "Yes, I am. I realize that my own stubbornness and defensiveness have only served to escalate the tension between us, and that's not fair to either of us." She regarded me silently for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to my astonishment, the rigid set of her shoulders began to relax. I suppose I should apologize as well," she admitted, her gaze dropping to her mug. "I know I have a tendency to overreact sometimes, and I'm sure that hasn't made things any easier between us." I felt a surge of relief at her words, and I reached out to gently rest my hand on her arm. "Hey, no need to apologize. We're both guilty of letting this feud get out of hand. But I think if we're willing to make an effort, we can find a way to move past it." Karen lifted her head, her eyes meeting mine with a newfound sense of vulnerability. I'd like that," she murmured, the corners of her mouth turning upward in a tentative smile. As we continued to talk, I was struck by how the rigid barriers between us seemed to slowly crumble. Karen shared stories of her own childhood and the difficulties she had faced in her life, and I, in turn, opened up about my own struggles and insecurities. By the time our coffee had grown cold, I couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. Perhaps, with time and patience, we could forge a genuine friendship out of the ashes of our long-standing feud. Over the next few weeks, Karen and I made a concerted effort to put our differences behind us. We shared meals, took walks around the neighborhood, and even collaborated on a community garden project. To my surprise, I found myself genuinely enjoying her company, and I sensed that the feeling was mutual. One afternoon, as we were tending to the garden, Karen paused, her brow furrowing thoughtfully. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what happened that day with the judge," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt a twinge of unease, unsure of where she was going with this. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. Karen let out a heavy sigh. I feel terrible about the way I behaved. Losing my temper like that in front of a respected member of the community, it was totally uncalled for. I nodded, recalling the raw fury that had twisted her features that day. Yeah, it was a pretty intense outburst, I admitted. I just... Karen's gaze dropped to the soil, her fingers fidgeting nervously. I guess I let my emotions get the better of me. I've always had a bit of a temper, but that day, I completely lost control. I reached out and gave her arm a gentle squeeze. Hey, it's okay. We've all been there, you know. The important thing is that we're trying to move past it. Karen lifted her head, a rueful smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. That's just it. I'm not sure I deserve your forgiveness. After all the grief I've caused you over the years, Karen. I interrupted firmly. Stop. We've both made mistakes, but we're here now, trying to make things right. That's what counts. She studied me for a long moment, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You're really not mad at me? I shook my head, offering her a reassuring smile. Not at all. In fact, I'm grateful that we've been able to find a way to put the past behind us. Karen let out a shaky laugh, swiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know what I did to deserve a neighbor like you, she murmured. You didn't have to do anything, I replied, my voice soft. Sometimes, people just need a second chance. As we continued tending to the garden, the air between us felt lighter, the tension that had once defined our relationship slowly dissipating. I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at how far we had come, and a growing conviction that our newfound friendship would only continue to flourish. Little did we know, however, that our newfound harmony was about to be tested in the most unexpected of ways. A few weeks after our heartfelt garden conversation, Karen and I were enjoying a leisurely afternoon stroll through the neighborhood when we spotted a commotion unfolding just a few blocks away. As we drew closer, we could hear the distinct sound of raised voices and the wail of police sirens. My heart sank as I recognized the familiar figure of Judge Hendricks, his robe disheveled, standing on the sidewalk alongside a group of officers. What on earth is going on? Karen murmured, her brow furrowed with concern. I shook my head, my stomach twisting with a sense of unease. I have no idea, but it doesn't look good. Cautiously, we approached the scene, and I felt Karen tense up beside me as the judge caught sight of us. Ah, there you are, he called out, his voice strained. I was hoping you two might be able to shed some light on this unfortunate situation. Karen and I exchanged a puzzled glance before stepping forward. What happened, Your Honor? I asked, my voice laced with trepidation. Judge Hendricks let out a weary sigh. It appears that one of your neighbors, Mrs. Wilkins, has been the victim of a burglary. Karen's eyes widened, and I felt my stomach twist with dread. Mrs. Wilkins? But she's such a sweet old lady. Who would do something like that? The judge's expression darkened. That's what we're trying to determine. He paused, his gaze shifting meaningfully between Karen and me. And I'm afraid the initial evidence is pointing to a rather unexpected suspect. My breath caught in my throat as the implication dawned on me. You don't mean... I'm afraid so. Judge Hendricks interrupted, his voice grave. Mrs. Wilkins has positively identified you, Karen, as the one who broke into her home and assaulted her. Karen's face drained of color, and I felt my heart plummet. That's impossible, she cried, her voice trembling. I would never. The judge raised a hand, effectively silencing her. I understand your shock and denial, but the facts seem to speak for themselves. Mrs. Wilkins reported seeing you fleeing the scene, and the officers found evidence of a forced entry. I stared at the judge, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Not after all the progress Karen and I had made. There has to be some mistake, I insisted, my voice laced with desperation. Karen would never do something like this. But as I glanced at Karen, the haunted expression on her face told a different story, and in that moment, A sinking feeling of dread and disbelief settled in the pit of my stomach. As the gravity of the situation sank in, I watched in stunned silence as two police officers approached Karen, their faces stoic. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us down to the station," one of the officers said, his voice devoid of emotion. Karen's eyes widened in panic, and she turned to me, her expression pleading. "I swear, I didn't do this," she stammered, her voice trembling. "You have to believe me." I wanted to believe her, I truly did. But the damning evidence, coupled with Judge Hendricks' stern demeanor, made it increasingly difficult to maintain my conviction in her innocence. "Karen, I faltered, unsure of what to say. "I don't know what to think." The officers moved in, gently but firmly taking hold of Karen's arms. As she was led away, her cries of protest echoing through the quiet suburban street, I felt a profound sense of disbelief and sorrow wash over me. How could this be happening? After all the progress we had made, after finally putting our differences aside and forging a genuine friendship, was it all for naught? I turned to Judge Hendricks, my eyes searching his face for any sign of sympathy or doubt. But his expression remained stoic, his gaze unwavering. "I'm sorry you had to witness this, young man," he said, his voice laced with a tinge of regret. "But the law must take its course." I nodded numbly, my mind whirling with 1,000 unanswered questions. As I watched the police car disappear down the street, a single thought refused to leave my mind. Had I been a fool to trust Karen, or was there more to this story than met the eye?